encourage people to call in by saying, call in so we don't have to do fan fiction.
Yeah, no, we'll never get
demanding
calls.
fan fiction.
I know.
Can I read this email about raids that we got?
No.
No.
Okay.
I mean, we just got
fanfic time. No.
No.
This is just an email we got from Gigapants of Excalibur, who just summed up a lot of what I feel about the current rating scene. It says, this goes out to Nika and Ascalia, mostly as you two are heavily involved in the rating scene. All right, let's not drop words like heavily involved. That's a little extreme, but
actively.
Yeah. How can you stomach these raids, if you can even call them that? FF14 has some of the worst raiding content I have ever participated in. It barely feels like you are actually raiding something as opposed to just being glorified primals. Every encounter feels isolated from one another due to zero connectivity throughout the raid between bosses. Not having any tangible connectivity to the main story isn't doing itself any favors either. The 24-man raids are arguably structured better than the 8-man raids, albeit still not ideal. They at least have connectivity between bosses so that it actually gives a sense that you are raiding something. Variety is also lacking. 4 bosses per 4 to 5 month raid period? Really? The bosses, at least in Alexander, have almost zero lore implications, which is a huge mistake that ties back to it not being a part of the main story. All of this compounds onto the issue of 14's raid structure. It really is just, here's a bunch of bosses we created, insert random model, fight them. It's so lazy and uninspired. The excuse of people missing out on main story because of the raid barrier of entry is not valid anymore with normal mode existing. Almost with anyone with half a brain can clear this. This is what is keeping me in WoW over 14. Having 3 raids so far, each with their own zones and a combined total of 20 bosses thus far since the launch of Legion, and another 9 boss raid coming in the next 2 or 3 months, how can you even compare? Oh, and all of them are extremely tied to the main story and have major lore implications. If Squeenix can get their shit together and stop churning out one disappointment after another that's taking resources away from developing raid content, then maybe we will see improvements. Until then, I fully expect Alexander to be repeated all over again.
Now,
Peace.
this is what I like about this email, because all of that was completely valid. This email was written in March.
Yeah, pretty much.
4 months ago, huh? How about that?
And yet
it still holds just as true today.
Yeah, exactly. Isn't that kind of concerning? Because,
Yes.
because to me, again, this speaks to the fact that these problems are way longer standing than just Stormblood. And again,
wait, but the raids haven't come out yet, so you don't know
they
for
haven't.
certain
See,
if
that's
they're
why
going
I'm
to
holding.
be like
I mean,
that again.
It's true that I think Omega is going to be exactly the same, but
We'll know in a
wonder
week.
that some
Say
of
we
this
don't know,
compelling
Nika.
content they say is coming, and maybe Eureka, who knows?
Okay, but no, here's the problem. Eureka is 100% going to be for the relic weapon, which is 100% casual content.
But Dynamis was for the relic weapon, and that wasn't casual content.
But
Are you citing 11?
But the relic weapons in this game are casual content.
Yeah,
and they've never been anything but.
And Yoshi P has said that explicitly. He's said explicitly, that relic weapons are supposed to be casual content.
Didn't he say you're a scrub if you get a relic weapon? I remember him saying something like that.
Yeah, it's for the casual specifically. Yeah.
And which I think is very I think that there's a certain amount of dissonance, like cognitive dissonance, that ends up putting out there. Like, it's so fucking confusing to have your relic weapon be for your casual fucking players. It is. It's just not a concept that I think.
But and this
works.
is where I think they speak so true is that that it's not tied into the main story when you have a normal mode version of it is so beyond unacceptable.
Yeah.
And the fact that, like, literally the bosses that we fought in Alexander, you could have put them almost anywhere in the game, with the exception of, like, Alexander.
Yeah.
Like, you could have put Ark.
The final one.
Ark could have been anywhere. Arc
Yeah.
Chaser, whatever the fuck they called it.
Yeah, and I think that is a big problem. Another thing that they identified that I really liked was that none of the raids or bosses or confrontations seem to play one into another.
No.
lore,
The
nothing.
only exception to that is Brute Justice.
Okay, yeah.
That's the only exception to that rule in Alexander, right?
Yeah.
That's the only time one thing played into another.
Yeah, you're right.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And the thing is that Coil had that feel. I mean, granted, they gave us
It did.
stupid things like T3 where we were like sonicking around, but even still, it felt like we were actually exploring Bahamut's prison and we were going to like,
Or that some of the bosses actually mattered, like Nail. I mean, Nail, him or herself, if you want to look at it.
Yeah.
usually in the lore, as well as fucking Phoenix.
Well, and just
Like-
there's that
Yeah.
one term where all you're doing is like dropping down, like it's a jumping puzzle to get down.
Yeah,
but
T3, that's what I was
you
talking
feel, T3, you're feeling like you're trying to get down to the next section of coil.
You're
Yeah.
actually
And then
rating
T4 was
something.
an entire it was just an elevator, but
Yeah, but you were nevertheless going to the next section of the raid. That's the whole purpose of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's just so much about this email that I agree with on its face and that I appreciate. Again, like you said, this being written 3 months ago and still ringing exactly as true today as it did when it was
Right.
wrin, I think is
but I mean 3 months ago there hasn't been any new
Right.
raids since
Yeah.
then.
To be fair, no
True.
new raid content has come out since then.
true.
So I'm curious to say, I mean, I have a feeling that it will still hold true. But
Yeah, if it
after
still
the
holds-
next raid cycle, if this email still holds true, I don't
But
even know.
that's exactly the thing, though, is that as long as it copies and pastes the structure that came before it, it absolutely will ring true.
Yeah, I need this. It's like, even if in this section of Omega, there's just make the bosses play into one another, make me feel like going from tier 1 to
Even
tier
if
4.
it's not totally different, just give us something that feels fresh. That's all.
Right. If I can get through tier 1 to tier 4 and I feel like I've gone on a journey from tier 1 to tier 4, I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
But I need those bosses to not look like just like, hey, we're doing an Omega themed raid. Can you draw 4 things that look like Omega kind of?
Right.
No.
Yeah, and all of that is massively disappointing once you get your hands on it. And again, a lot of people were very critical about Alexander Extreme and how the first turn of it was, or the first 4 confrontations in it.
Right.
Were very hard. There was a strong emphasis on DPS output, and they had boosted the challenge quite a bit. And I think everyone gonna go when they look back on it, that's what they blame it on. They were like, "Oh, well, Square Enix tried to make it too hard too quick," and all of these steps of faith nerfers and all of those idiots kind of come out and they point to that and they go, "See, this is what happens when Square Enix makes things too hard."
But you can do it right, and they did it. Like the difficulty in the next 2 steps was fine.
It was, and I actually think that the hit to the rating scene came from everyone being able to experience everything out of the easy mode and going, well, that's it. Like that's the experience that they're going to offer. Like, why do I want to have
what
that?
you asked for.
Like, why do I want to have this experience in an extreme mode? Like, I think that fundamental question was at the heart of why am I participating in Alexander? You didn't have that question with Binding Coil of Bahamut, which is exactly what we were saying when we were saying don't put in an easy mode, because the motivation there was inherent.
Right.
It was to see the story. I could give a shit if I got gear out of that. I didn't really care if I got gear out of it, because eventually I'd probably get some piece of gear if I kept doing it.
Yeah. Well, eventually you just outscaled as soon as the expansion was over.
Well, we didn't really know that at
True.
the time. But
Well.
my real motivation for sticking to it for all 3 turns, because I dabbled in the first turn and then found a group for second and third. And the reason I kept coming back was because I wanted to see those story moments.
Yeah. Yeah, and like even later on, like Bahamut is totally worth going back and doing all those.
And
even now, as you can blow through them, it's totally
It's
worth
still
going back
cool
to see it.
just to
Yes.
see it all. Like there's so much about it was cool.
And even though the Alexander story and cutscenes were not as up to par as Binding Coil was.
That's an understatement.
That's a very diplomatic way to put that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the nicest thing you've ever said.
And I think that you wouldn't have seen the same fall off that you did if people had to work to find that information out. Like if you weren't just given a shitty story on a platter that you didn't have to work for, but it was a shitty story that you had to actually work for.
Which is worse, to not have
I
to
don't
work for it or
know.
to work for it?
I honestly, I really don't know what would have been worse in this
If I had
case.
put the work into clearing Gordius and gotten that story from it, I might have been pissed. Like if that's the story I'd gotten out of the effort I put into Gordius.
And I wouldn't have been, I don't think I would have been able to argue that you shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, like saying in the chat, Coil's story was worth that work.
It was.
Alexander's wouldn't have been.
I also agree with that assessment. But I don't think that the drop-off would have been quite as dramatic. I don't think that the bottoming out of the raiding scene community, most raid groups, I mean, I'm gonna just throw out a random number, and this is just, based on my own anecdotal evidence, but I'm gonna say that 35% of raid groups did not make the jump between Binding Coil and Alexander.
I think more made the jump, but
they got to A3 and then everyone broke.
I think they disbanded in Gordius. I think that during Gordius, where you saw a lot of groups go, you know what, this story sucks anyway. Fuck this.
This isn't worth it.
I think most people who did Coil probably gave Alexander
got to
a chance
A3 and
at least tried it, and then they said, "Fuck this."
Okay,
that would be my guess.
All right, I guess I can agree with that.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I totally understand not making the raid literally connect with the main story, but then I'm hoping that Omega, since it is tied in with Nero and Sid and what we're doing, that it will tie in as hopefully.
Why would you?
That's what happened in Alexander.
But the thing is with Alexander is that it was supposed to tie in. I was hoping to get more lore about Charlene and everything and the people who bound it, but instead we just got stupid goblin content.
That's fair. That's
and
fair.
a forced love story. And I feel like if they had actually given us the real lore history of Charlene and talked about that rather than just here's this girl and she's in love with this guy who's inside, and that's not what.
Nika. No, actually, that's a really good point, because I also think that I did have a certain amount of expectation to learn more about,
why the fuck is it under there in the first
place? Or what, why, because, it's in the Dravanian hinterlands, right? Why is that civilization there so fucking destroyed? We actually never really learned that much about the Charleans throughout the entirety of Heavensward.
That's not Charlene proper.
No, it's not. It's not.
And it's weird because that they apparently Doma got taken over and the Charleans left because they were scared they would be next, and then their whole town just fell and nobody ever went back. It's really bizarre, and we don't really know much else besides that.
Well, and one thing that's a little different this time around is with Alexander, we didn't get our first look at Alexander and the fact that was going to be our raid until we got to that zone. Once the expansion had launched and once we were already that far into it.
Well,
whereas this time, the whole thing that went down with Omega to give everyone an introduction happened in the MSQ before the expansion.
So it feels a little more tied in.
It does feel a bit more tied in.
Yeah, the stakes are inherently different. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You have a history with Nail, you have a history with the Calamity, you have a personal history and an investment in all of those things. Maid and her boyfriend and all of that dumb shit, the fucking goblins, I felt like I was a fly on the wall looking at somebody else's story that I didn't care about.
I would have loved to have all of the people who are actually from Charlene, Y'shtola, Elfina, all of them kind of discussing how this affects their history. That would have been so much cooler.
Yeah, but instead you're just shoved off into this Ora clan who you don't know anything about them. You have no attachment to them. They don't play a greater lore aspect in the world.
Right.
And then they end up just shoehorning that fucking horn from 1.0 almost to try to make it have some sort of desperate relevance.
And that's the thing too, is with Binding Coil, we knew who Alice was. We hadn't done tons with her, but we knew who she was. We knew who Louis Soir was. We knew what the stakes of the Calamity were.
It felt personal.
And that's where I do have a bit more hope for the story of Omega, is that because it's been built into the MSQ, even if not greatly, at least I have some concept of who all these characters are and why they matter.
But hang on, is Ilberd's is the fight against Ilberd your fucking fight?
The fight against Ilberd?
If you think about the things that have led to Omega, right? You've got Ilberd and his sacrifice or suicide, whichever way you want to put it, to create the primal. To be able to create the primal, right? How much of a personal connection do we have to that? And again, I
want to say we had a pretty big one at first. I mean, Ilberd was part of Ul'dah. We were there when him and Raubahn had the whole.
It came to blows, but it's Raubah's fight though. Again, we were personally involved with Louis Soir, right? We had time.
Yeah, he was a quest giver.
and when he turned into Phoenix, I was there was that little moment of oh man, I got to kill fucking Louis Soir.
Yeah, I don't want to do that. Hey,
and it felt personal, right? Like you're going up against Nail, right? Like that was the same person. If you had been playing 1.0, that was the same person that you had to beat to complete the fucking thing. It felt like everything was coming full circle from 1.0, and things were becoming more fleshed out from 1.0. And then there was this reversion once we got into Heavensward. There was this like very sudden reversion where we went back, and now we're a fly on a wall for a story that doesn't really involve us. And I feel like there is at least a little bit of that with the Raubahn Ilberd conflict. Yes, we were present for the bloody banquet. Yes, we were present to see his arm get removed.
And Ilberd was a crystal brave.
And we were able to see his pain and anger, but it wasn't ours. It's still not ours. To this day, it's still not ours. And even if you don't,
we're a soldier pledged to the grand companies, though. To be fair, when something like this happens to one of our own, doesn't it become our friends?
No,
it's different though. It is different. It's not going to be as bad as Heavensward was, but I think that Nate's right. We might not be a fly on the wall now. Now we're just going to be a supportive friend from the sidelines.
And that's really the thing. Like, I feel like there is a disconnect when you try to focus all of the narrative aspects on your main character, on the player character, right? On yourself. And it feels like the entire world revolves around you and what your actions are doing, and you're saving the fate of the world. It all hinges on what you, the warrior of light, are doing. Except for Alexander, except for like you're just a bit player in this thing, in this conflict between a stupid fucking goblin and a couple who you don't really care about, you know, like and that.
I want to say yes, you're right, and I was gonna say like a similar thing to that, but I feel like I want to say going into Stormblood, I actually thought that they did a good job of making us not feel like the center of attention, and I liked that. Like I liked that I was a supportive friend, and I felt that a lot of the solo player instances, I really just felt like a soldier in the army. And I thought that was fucking awesome.
But that's part of the problem. That adds to the disconnect because you can't have it both ways. You have to. Your game world has either got to not even give a fuck that you're there and feel like it continues to exist and move on without your influence, or you have to make everything hinge on the player character. When you try to have it both ways, I think it feels very confusing, and it feels that's when we get this disconnect, like things aren't fitting together.
Yeah,
right.
I agree with
you guys haven't finished this.
Just talk all at once, please.
I can't see him. I don't know what he's gonna talk.
But I think in this one, this is going to be much more of Cid and Nero's story rather than Raubahn and Ilberd. I don't think we're going to see much of Raubahn or Ilberd in this.
Oh, no, I don't
think I think this is going to be much more about Cid and Nero.
I'm just saying that the setup for it, though, the setup for it was a conflict between two people that was longer standing than our relationship with them. We see it culminate in one point of like very well executed narrative tension, and then. Like for an entire expansion, we're kind of like left to sort of sit with that. And
it's kind of hard though, because now we're going to different, like our character is from Eorzea and the Three Nations, regardless of what backstory we give to our characters in our headcanon. But when you think about it now, we went to Charlotte and we went to Ala Mhigo, like our character, regardless, is not from these places. And so it's kind of hard now to keep our character as the main center of attention when this isn't going to be our fight. And if we want to keep expanding to different parts of the world, our character is not from those areas either, and it doesn't affect us in the ways that would affect Raubahn or Y'shtola or whoever. So I think being the supportive friend is kind of the role we need to be right now.
Do they ever say where we're from originally?
No, we're just an adventurer that shows up one day heading towards one. I don't even know if we're from Eorzea. We're on a cart on our way to one of the nations, and you're like, have you been there before? You can click yes or no. Like Surin in his headcanon is from Ala Mhigo, but really your character's not from Ala Mhigo. So it's like, it's kind of hard at that point if we want to keep expanding. I don't think the Warrior of Light can be the center of attention. I think they still look to us like a commander. They still look to us like a hero, and everyone still calls you a hero. But because that's what you're doing. You're helping everyone liberate and save the day, la la la. But you are not the center of the story. You're just
okay. But that's not what we had for 2 expansions, right? Like A Realm Reborn wasn't like that. Everything was
tight. A Realm Reborn was everything around you.
Yeah, everything, and it was, and you felt personally invested in more stuff, right? And
Yes.
even if you weren't a 1.0 player, I think just the way that the entire thing is presented is much more personal, right? And it's much more palpably personal. And I at Heavensward, I feel like they tried to hit on both columns, and
Yeah.
it spread himself too thin.
In Heavensward, we were very much the outsiders coming in and like, hey, we have a chance to help these people.
Right.
And that's what we did.
Right. And you did feel like, a little bit removed and less personally involved. But I think that it was the most obvious and the most visible with Alexander.
That I can completely agree with, yeah.
And I think that the problem is it's taken us a while to really kind of put our finger on it, but I think that's where you saw the biggest detriment in that. Because I'm not saying Heavensward didn't work or was a bad expansion by any means. I'm not saying Stormblood doesn't work or is a bad expansion. I'm not through enough of it to be able to give any kind of evaluation on it. What I'm saying is that there was a definitive switch between A Realm Reborn and Heavensward of the role that you as the player character are assuming. Now, to be fair, Square Enix may have tried to make that clear by removing Altana's gift, by having Midgar Somer remove
block it or whatever he was doing.
right. And I mean, eventually, you
unlock it again,
he unlocks it again. But I feel like if you were supposed to read between the lines from a narrative perspective, it was sort of trying to reset your expectations and say you're not going to have the same centralized role in this section of the story moving forward. But the way that they wrote most of the scenarios, you did.
Yeah, well,
I see what you're saying, that they kind of tried to have you be the center of attention without having to be the center of attention.
Exactly, yeah.
right. Well, that's the thing is like
I think Stormblood does it better. I actually think that the entire time they look at you like a commander and they look to you for guidance, but in the end, you're just a soldier. And I feel like I liked it a lot.
Yeah, in Heavensward, like they were coming off Realm Reborn, where you were nothing short of the savior. Like
I said Altana, didn't I?
Yes, you did.
I'm sorry.
You're this person who appears who cannot be influenced by primals, so you're actually able to combat them when no one
Right.
can. You are the savior come to save this world. And then when they sent you to Heavensward, because the problem with you being the savior who ends it all is that gets boring real fast.
Right.
So they tried to reset it back to that, but they still wrote the story the same way.
But here's
with you in a different position.
Right, and I think that Stormblood has the ability to sort of reset that expectation a little bit easier because, while we didn't have access to Ishgard, right? Like, and there were things that prevented our progress into these Ishgardian areas, we weren't physically removed from that end of the world like we are with Alamigo and Baelsar's Wall. We're not physically removed from that end of the world like we are with Authored. And so now when you have that, like, it felt like in Heavensward, like you did all of these epic, amazing things, and only word of that stuff is only now just starting to reach the hinterlands and shit like that. Where it should have felt more like a part of a living world that was all kind of interconnected instead of, well, this is our expansion areas, so we're going to have to move the time bubble a little bit forward here.
Well, and you do get a little bit of that with like when you go to the first few missions over with the Resistance, people know who you are. Like,
right.
Oh, you're the Warrior of Light. That's awesome. You're here to help us. That's great. And then when you get to Authard for the first time, a lot of people are kind of like,
they don't know who you are.
Scalia, Rhea, who?
Yeah,
like they don't. Like,
which I think is an important distinction to make. And I think if
it is kind of cool to see the difference in the soldiers. Like the Resistance is definitely like their morale's boosted when they see you walk around, but the people in Doma are still like.
And I think to that end, I think that Square Enix has a bit more of the opportunity to reset those expectations and allow for those kinds of scenarios to unfold and take place. But I think what they've set up for themselves with A Realm Reborn being sort of like, even now in hindsight, their most well remembered, their most fondly remembered pieces of content, I think that does cast a big shadow on everything that comes forward. And Stormblood, if it wants to lift itself out of the shadow of the rest of FF14, I really do feel like at some point the FF14 team is going to need to do the amount of heavy lifting that they did between 1.0 and 2.0 to be able to reinvigorate the core community and the veteran community.
Yeah.
And again, that is a lot of heavy lifting, and I understand that. And it's not even a request. I just think that it's probably what's going to happen to have this game continue to evolve and to be successful. If they think that they can do 5.0, literally copying and pasting the way that Heavensward and Stormblood preceded it, I think that they're really going to have a problem because they set their expectations so high by breaking so many conventions going in between 1.0 and 2.0.
Yeah, at this point, you say 5.0, I need things to be different now. I need the 4.x line to do that.
We were saying that, though. We were saying that, 4.x should be the point where you focus on not new acquisitions, but your veteran player base. And to be able to do that, I think, takes a massive shift in the way that the development team approaches making new content. And I think that if you take Stormblood as our example, I don't think that we're going to be getting at this expansion. We may not get it ever.
Well, if you're going to do it, it's going to take a bold choice, and it's going to take someone.
And that's scary. It is.
It is scary, but it's going to take someone at Square Enix, like Yoshi, or someone on that team to feel that, to be on board with that bold choice and go to bat for it.
Yeah.
And and I get coming out of the disaster that was 1.0 and the fear of ever returning to it, that might be nerve-wracking. But if you want your game to survive, you got to make a bold choice every now and then. You don't have to do something crazy every expansion. You don't. But every 3, maybe, you kind of do.
But I feel like the fear is that one catastrophic patch could do it. Could be the difference between, in the point of view of the devs, that they're just trying to avoid that one catastrophic decision, that one catastrophic move off of what has worked to something that is less sound or less predictably. The outcome is going to be predictable from it, right?
But that place that you get to, that place where one catastrophic patch is all it takes, that place is bred out of malaise, out of years of it all being the same.
Right. Because here's the truth of it, is that every MMO eventually gets to that place. It's a question of how quickly or slowly you get there. And I understand that Square Enix may be trying to make sure that the fall off is a slow bleed instead of, a cliff.
Right.
Yep. And I understand that. But if you want to keep, you want to retain people long term, I think that you've really got to give a lot of thought to the way that you present your content as a whole moving forward in an expansion, in a patch.
Raising the level cap in 11 was a bold decision, and it changed that game forever. You were never going back to how it was before that, after you made that decision.
When it happened, it needed to happen.
It did. Everyone was watching, and somehow, even though it needed to happen so bad, everyone was watching was just as stunned. You couldn't believe that it actually did happen.
Yeah.
You're just watching, oh, cool, what new job ability for Paladin are they going to show off? And then he levels up, and you're like,
the one.
Oh.
And there was another quote from Yoshi P. And again, I'm paraphrasing from this documentary, and that was, he said, it was really their choice to make a bold choice, right? To say, not only, and there were 2 bold choices that they made, by the way. Okay, the first bold choice was that we're going to destroy much of the land that we had built.
Yep.
And we're going to rework this thing from the ground up. That was the first impressive choice that they made. And the second one was that they were going to continue to develop 1.0 while working on 2.0. They were essentially going to double their workload and not give up on the continued development of the players that they already had. That was an important point that he made.
Yeah.
That without the players that they had already gained, that there would have been no way for this project to continue.
I wonder what happened to that sentiment.
the fact that it's in that documentary, to me, signals that Yoshi P on some level does get it.
Yeah, he recognizes it.
Right.
But you got to also be willing to act on that at some point.
Yes. And it makes me concerned about the will to do things over there. And that's not a personal criticism of Yoshi P. That's not a criticism of any one member of their staff. That's a criticism of the culture.
Do you think he still has the sway and authority to make a bold choice like that right now, as it is? If he went to SE and said, I want to do something bold?
Honest to God, I think that if Yoshi P really believed in something and he really pulled for it and said, I believe in this. It may be a weird decision. You may not understand it, but I think that this is the only thing that can keep this game alive. I think that, yes, he would advocate for it. And I think that he would I think.
And SE would allow it?
I don't. That's the question.
That's my question is, do you think he still has the authority to make a bold choice like that? He can believe it. And like you say, because on some level,
no one has the ability to make that choice. Like, there's no one person. Like, that's a committee choice. Mm-hmm. There's no way that something like this game doesn't get past
the board of directors has to say yes.
Yeah,
I agree. I think that's partially the difference, because at that time they were so desperate with 1.0 that if a guy says I have a bold decision, they might be willing to listen to it. But right now, while it's making them a fuck ton of money, it's harder to get a board of directors on board with a crazy change.
And again, that's why I'm not criticizing Yoshi P as a person. I'm criticizing the culture that exists, and entrenched thinking. Mm-hmm. And for all the good that Square Enix has done with this development team, for all the things that they do right, like their transparency, like their willingness to be open with their fan base, their willingness to communicate with the fan base, all of those things are I think very important, and things that they are very good at. They've been very good at.
Yep.
But I do think that there's shit that needs to be fixed. Like, there's absolutely stuff that's not working. As long-term players, we've identified that it's not working. A lot of people have gotten their butts hurt about that opinion. But the thing is that I think that we've outlined in countless shows why it's valid to feel like that. And again, I'm totally willing to be the guy that ends up taking the heat and taking the flack for having a much more honest conversation. Because